boring, jarring, missing a lot of things that would make it a game. These are all snippets of feedback I got after releasing part 1 of my indie game. I've just shared my game for the first time and now I'm faced with this feedback. Well, they were right. So, what did I do with it? I'll show you. Show your work. And when the right people show up, pay close attention to them, because they'll have a lot to show you. This is the final line in Austin Kleon's fantastic book, Show Your Work. Showing your work is not an easy thing to do, especially if you've never done it before. This was true for me releasing the first part of my indie game, Flat 207. At first I sent it to a couple friends, then some colleagues, and finally I posted my last video releasing it to the world. It was a slow rollout, but ultimately a successful one. And by successful I mean I got a good chunk of feedback and I'm not discouraged by it. In fact, the opposite, it was inspiring. And not because it was all positive, most of it was negative, constructive feedback. But it showed that people cared, at least enough to give me some feedback, presumably in the hopes to improve the game. So let me show you the feedback I got and hopefully encourage you to share something you're working on and get feedback on it too. Okay, so first thing I always do when I receive feedback is I write it down in Notion. This isn't sponsored or anything, it's just been an extremely beneficial tool for me over the last few years. If you haven't heard about it before, Notion is the best note-taking app I've ever used, which actually sells it a little short because it does far more than just take notes. I'd honestly recommend Notion to anyone. I use it all the time to keep track of projects and store ideas. Usually when I get an idea, it goes into my Apple Notes app on my phone in a really rough form. And then when I get back to my laptop, I transfer it to Notion in a more organised way. A key bit of feedback I got was that essentially the game was boring. Now, this is usually a killer for a game, and it's definitely a problem for mine at the moment. But the reason I say usually, and why I'm not panicking too much about this feedback, is because of some of the other feedback I got from the same person and from others. People are enjoying the concept. They're getting a little hooked on the vibe and the atmosphere, even if the game itself isn't as engaging as it could be. So with that being said, there are a few things we can do to make the game a bit more gamey. Flat 207 leans heavily on its story and atmosphere to rope players in. It wants to make them want to uncover the mystery. So let's lean into this a little further with some gameplay elements. Currently in the hallway I have some paintings, doors, doormats and some rubbish. You can also see through to another building out the window. These are all pretty menial things and reflect my restrictions as a solo dev. All of these items came from an asset pack. I don't have the luxury of creating bespoke items for the game, and that's just not where my skills lie. So my plan is to add interactivity to these seemingly meaningless objects. You can see I've got some cards here for adding in the new feature. First I need to write the interaction descriptions for each object. This is the information that will pop up when the player examines an object. Next I have a card to add a slight zoom when interacting or examining something. I want a subtle way of signifying to the user that they're in a dialogue or examine mode. And then the final card on this bit of feedback is to actually add in the controls to be able to examine something. So I started on the first card and I wrote up all the interaction descriptions for each object, and then moved on to adding a small zoom when the player interacts or examines something. So, heading over to the Unity editor, you can see what that looks like now. If you've played the game, you might notice that the scene is a little brighter. That's because of a test light I put into the scene when I'm working on it so I can see things a bit easier. You can actually turn off the lighting in the scene view in Unity using that light bulb icon in the scene view toolbar, but I like to still be able to get a rough idea of what the scene looks like when I'm working on it. Anyway, adding the interact zoom ended up being very easy. All I'm doing is slowly increasing and decreasing the camera field of view when the player interacts or stops interacting with something. You can see the camera component on the right there and see the field of view go from 60 to around 53 when we interact. Now that's done, I had to add the new controls to examine an object. This involves setting up a new control, new UI to display the examine text, and setting up new box colliders on objects that previously weren't interactable. This is what it looked like before. You can only interact with a couple of things, namely the doors, the painting, the tennis ball and the fuse box. And now after the changes, pretty much everything in the hallway is examinable. It's extremely simple, but that's alright. I'm all about keeping the scope of this project down because at the end of the day, we want to release the thing. The bits of info are a little mysterious, a bit introspective at times, and they're written in the second person. They're mostly written in a tone to unnerve the player, but there's some comedic ones in there too. They're designed to add more background to where the player is and the stories in the world that they're in, and at the same time add a little bit more interactivity into the game to keep the player engaged. On top of this, I addressed a couple more other issues, like the player being able to clip through the walls in a certain section of the game, and reducing the distance at which players can knock on the doors and examine objects, in an attempt to further reduce control from the player by making them get right up close to a door to knock on them. There are a couple of things I didn't fix yet. The first of which was an idea to make the power cut the fault of the player. I think this is a great idea. It'll make the player feel like they've done something wrong and make them think they've put themselves in the situation and that they need to fix their own mistake. I'm not adding this yet because it's not vital to finishing the game. My aim right now is to get a complete version of the game and then come back and finish up things and improve them, so I'm keeping this waiting for now. The same goes for adding backstory as to why you're in the hallway, another really good suggestion that I will come back to later. And finally, there was feedback telling me that they could see texture seams on my wall textures, and about how I have high detail wall textures and low poly objects like the plant pot, and how they don't quite match. This is totally true and in an ideal world would be fixed, but as a solo indie dev, this is what I've got to work with. The low poly objects are from a different asset pack than the wall textures, so naturally they look a bit out of place. I don't think it looks terrible right now, but it's something I'll sit on. Right now this will stay as it is, as it's just a symptom of me struggling in the graphics department. We'll revisit it in the future. There was one bit of positive feedback that stuck with me. I was genuinely disappointed when it ended. This was the most encouraging feedback I received, and bearing in mind it came after a paragraph of things to improve from the same person. I think for the most part, people leave constructive feedback, and constructive feedback is given because people care. Either they know you and just want to help, or they enjoyed the game, the book, the video and want to see more and help you improve. If you're sitting on something that you want to share with the world, I'd encourage you to show your work. Maybe start with a friend first, see how that feels, then try a couple more friends and maybe a family member. And then when you're ready, try putting it on the internet. People seem to find these things even if it's the first time you post something, and there's nothing quite like getting feedback from a stranger. Knowing someone took the time to look at the thing you made and tell you what they thought, and ultimately it's encouraging. It helps you finish the project. It's probably the biggest boost I've had to finish this thing, and I intend to do so.